The park was Jackson's one spot of calm in a world that had often shown him more hardship than kindness. For him, the shade under an old, sturdy oak tree provided a place to pause, a rare moment of peace as life continued around him. Sitting there, he could almost forget the heavy burdens of his reality, if only for a little while. But today, the peace was disrupted by a high-pitched cry, followed by mocking laughter that echoed across the playground. Jackson's gaze shifted immediately toward the commotion. There, a young boy, no older than 7 or 8, stood surrounded by a group of boys who looked a few years older. Jackson could see the small boy clutching his backpack, his pale face etched with fear as the bullies taunted him. "Please, just stop," the boy pleaded, his voice barely audible over the jeers and snickers from the kids around him. Instinctively, Jackson's fingers tightened around the fabric of his worn coat. Years of experience had taught him to avoid unnecessary trouble and to stay invisible whenever possible. But something in the leader of the group, a tall boy with a defiant glare and a mean sneer, hit too close to home. He shoved the smaller child so forcefully that the young boy stumbled and fell to the ground, sending his backpack skidding. "You think you're better than us, just because your dad's got money?" the bully jeered, kicking a clump of dirt onto the kid's shoes. His friends laughed louder, encouraged by his actions. Jackson's pulse quickened as he watched the scene, a memory of his own teenage years surfacing unbidden. He had known anger like that before, a festering anger that grew out of loneliness and frustration. But this kid, this young boy trembling on the ground, didn't deserve any of it. No one did. Without giving himself time to second-guess, Jackson rose from his spot under the tree, moving toward the group with measured steps. His stride was calm but steady, each step purposeful as he closed the distance. "Hey!" Jackson called out, his voice firm but steady. At first, the bullies didn't seem to notice him, too absorbed in their game. Jackson raised his voice, sharper this time. "I said, hey!" The tall boy leading the group finally looked up, surprise flickering briefly across his face before he covered it with a sneer. "What do you want, old man?" he taunted, trying to look tough as he locked eyes with Jackson. Jackson took another step forward, his gaze unwavering. "Leave him alone," he said evenly. Though he spoke calmly, there was a subtle edge to his tone that made the boys hesitate. One of the smaller boys glanced at his leader, uncertain, while the leader himself took a small step back. "Still?" He tried to save face. "And who's going to make us?" he retorted, a hint of unease in his voice. Jackson didn't respond. He simply stared at them, his expression unchanging, his stance steady. The silence hung heavy for a moment, challenging the bully's bravado. The leader seemed to reconsider, mumbling to his friends, "Come on, let's go. This kid's not worth it." He shoved his hands into his pockets and walked off, the others reluctantly following him. The echoes of their laughter faded as they left the park. Only then did Jackson turn his attention to the boy on the ground, who was still clutching his backpack, his face streaked with tears. Jackson knelt beside him, his expression softening. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice gentle. The boy looked up, nodding slowly, though he was still trembling. Jackson extended a hand, and after a slight hesitation, the boy took it, letting Jackson help him to his feet. "Thank you," the boy whispered, clutching his backpack tightly against his chest. "I didn't know what to do." Jackson gave him a reassuring nod, brushing a bit of dirt from the boy's shoulder. "You don't need to thank me," he said, offering a kind smile. "Those kids are just bullies, not nearly as tough as they pretend to be." The boy nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "My name's Ben," he said, his voice still shaky. "Jackson," he replied. "You shouldn't be out here alone, though. Where are your parents?" As Jackson glanced around the park, he sensed something more to Ben's story and felt compelled to stay a bit longer. Ben glanced around the park nervously before answering, his small hands clutching the straps of his expensive-looking backpack. "My dad's supposed to pick me up," he mumbled, glancing toward the park entrance as if expecting to see him there any moment. Jackson noticed for the first time the boy's neatly pressed clothes and the high-end backpack he held so tightly. This kid was from a different world, one where people had things they took for granted, things Jackson could only dream of now. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Right now, All Jackson saw was a young boy who had needed someone to stand up for him. "Tell you what," Jackson said, keeping his voice calm and steady, "I'll stay with you until he gets here. How's that sound?" Ben's eyes brightened at the offer, and he nodded eagerly. "Thanks," he said, looking visibly relieved. They walked over to the bench where Jackson had been sitting under the large oak tree, and the two settled in quietly, Jackson keeping a careful eye on the park entrance. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Ben seemed content just to have someone nearby, while Jackson was still feeling the after effects of the adrenaline rush. It had been a while since he'd intervened in anything. Years of living on the street had taught him the importance of avoiding unnecessary conflict. Yet, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, staying out of this one hadn't felt like an option. Finally, a sleek black car pulled up along the park's edge. Ben perked up immediately, his face lighting up with relief. He jumped up from the bench, waving as a man in a sharp suit stepped out of the car. His face was stern, his gaze immediately focused on Ben with a look of intense concern. "Dad," Ben called, running over to him. The man's expression softened as he knelt to meet his son, pulling him into a hug. Jackson watched from a few steps away, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn coat, ready to slip away unnoticed. But then Ben turned back to look at him, and with a small nudge pointed Jackson out to his father. "This is Jackson," Ben said, looking up at his dad. "He helped me when those boys were being mean to me." The man's gaze shifted to Jackson, his eyes quickly scanning him from head to toe, taking in every detail, the frayed edges of his jacket, the worn look in his eyes, the tired stance of a man who had faced his own share of battles. Though his tone was polite, there was a slight edge of distance in his voice. "Thank you for helping my son," he said, nodding stiffly. Jackson nodded in return, his gaze meeting the man's briefly before he looked down. "Just glad he's okay," he murmured, shifting on his feet as he prepared to leave. The man placed a hand on Ben's shoulder and began to guide him back toward the car. "We need to get going," he said, glancing at his watch. "Say goodbye, Ben." Ben turned to Jackson, a small frown forming on his face. "Bye, Jackson. Thank you again," he said softly, clearly reluctant to leave his new friend. Jackson managed a small smile, lifting a hand in farewell. "Take care, kid," he replied, watching as Ben and his father got into the car and drove away, leaving him alone once more in the park. As the sound of the car engine faded into the distance, Jackson let out a long sigh. He turned back to his spot under the tree and sank down onto the bench, leaning against the rough bark. The autumn air felt cooler now, and he pulled his coat tightly around himself, bracing against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. For a brief moment, he had felt like he mattered again, like he could still make a difference in someone's life. Closing his eyes, Jackson let the quiet of the park surround him. Tomorrow, he knew, the struggle would resume, the search for food, for warmth, for a place to rest without being chased away. But today, he had something small but meaningful to hold on to, a reminder that despite everything, he could still be there for someone. As he relaxed against the bench, Jackson allowed himself a fleeting sense of peace, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city. He was just beginning to drift off when he sensed someone standing nearby. Opening his eyes, he was surprised to find Ben back beside him, his backpack clutched tightly to his chest, a hesitant look in his eyes. "Can I sit with you?" Ben asked, his voice small but hopeful. Jackson raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Shouldn't you be with your dad?" he asked gently. Ben glanced toward the entrance where the black car had disappeared moments earlier. "He had to take a call," he replied, looking a little embarrassed. "But he'll be back soon." After a moment, Jackson scooted over on the bench, making room for the boy. "Sure, kid," he said, patting the space beside him. "Take a seat." Ben climbed up onto the bench, his small legs swinging above the ground. They sat together in a comfortable silence, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. As they sat quietly, Ben's curiosity got the best of him, and he asked Jackson a question that would take him by surprise. They sat together on the bench, surrounded by the gentle buzz of the park. After a few moments, Ben turned to look at Jackson, studying him with the curious eyes of a child trying to understand something just out of reach. Finally, Ben broke the silence. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his voice a mix of confusion and gratitude. Jackson looked over at Ben, taken aback by the direct question. He hadn't really thought about it, he just did what felt right. But the way Ben looked up at him, earnest and wide-eyed, made Jackson think carefully about his response. "Well, because you needed help," Jackson said, choosing his words slowly. "No one should have to go through that alone." Ben seemed to ponder this, tilting his head slightly. "But you didn't know me," he said softly, "and you didn't have to do anything." Jackson chuckled, a quiet sound that was more like a sigh. "Sometimes, kid, you don't need to know someone to do the right thing. You just act." Ben nodded thoughtfully, looking down at his hands, which were busy tracing small circles on his backpack. After a moment he looked back up, as if another thought had struck him. "Do you live here?" Ben asked, glancing around the park as if expecting to find some hidden house among the trees. Jackson's mouth quirked up in a faint smile. "In a way, yeah," he replied, carefully avoiding the details. "I'm around here a lot." Ben didn't press further, but Jackson could see the wheels turning in his young mind. He knew kids had a way of asking questions that most adults avoided, questions that went straight to the heart of things. He braced himself for whatever would come next. "Do you have kids?" Ben asked suddenly, his voice soft but curious. Jackson's face grew a bit more serious. "No," he replied, shaking his head slowly. "Never had a family like that." Ben's brow furrowed, his young face filled with a seriousness beyond his years. "Why not?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. Jackson hesitated, caught off guard. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially with strangers, especially with a kid. How could he explain the twists and turns his life had taken, the mistakes and regrets that had brought him to this point? The truth was, he didn't want to burden Ben with that weight. "Life just didn't turn out that way for me," Jackson said simply, hoping it would be enough to satisfy the boy's curiosity. Ben seemed to sense that there was more to the story, but he didn't press further. Instead, he nodded, as if accepting Jackson's answer, and they returned to their comfortable silence. After a while, Ben spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. Do you ever get lonely?" The question caught Jackson off guard, hitting him harder than he'd expected. Loneliness was something he rarely acknowledged, even to himself. It was like an old coat he wore daily, frayed at the edges, heavy but familiar. It was just a part of his life now, something he had come to accept without much thought. "Sometimes," Jackson admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you get used to it." Ben didn't say anything right away. Instead, he pulled his backpack onto his lap, fiddling with the zipper as he gathered his thoughts. "I get lonely too," he finally said, so softly that Jackson almost didn't hear him. Jackson looked over at Ben, surprised. The boy had a father who clearly cared for him, a life that, from the outside, seemed full of everything a child could need. But Jackson knew better than anyone that loneliness didn't discriminate. It crept into lives regardless of wealth, status, or privilege. "Why do you feel lonely, kid?" Jackson asked, his tone gentle, not wanting to pry but genuinely curious. Ben shrugged, his eyes downcast. "My dad's always busy," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "He's a lawyer, so he works a lot. I don't get to see him much." Jackson nodded, understanding all too well. He knew what it was like to long for someone's time and attention, only to find they were always out of reach. It was a different kind of loneliness, but just as painful. "He cares about you, though," Jackson said, hoping to offer some comfort. "You can tell just by how he came here when you needed him. He'd drop everything to make sure you're okay." Ben managed a small smile at that, though the sadness in his eyes lingered. "Yeah, I know. But I still wish he wasn't so busy all the time." Jackson didn't have an answer for that. He couldn't tell Ben that things would magically get better, or that his dad would suddenly have more time for him. Life didn't work that way, and Jackson wasn't one for giving false hope. Instead, he reached over and gave Ben's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You're a strong kid, Ben," Jackson said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Don't forget that." Ben looked up at him, eyes wide and searching. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to say something more, but before he could, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. Ben's father was walking back toward them, his phone now put away. His expression softened as he approached. Jackson stood, ready to step aside. "Thank you for staying with him," Ben's father said to Jackson, his tone more sincere this time. Jackson simply nodded. No problem. Just glad he's okay. Bookmark. As they said goodbye, Jackson noticed Ben looking back over his shoulder, a hopeful smile on his face as if he didn't want this unexpected friendship to end. As Jackson watched Ben and his father walk away, a surprising feeling settled over him. Something between contentment and a faint longing. Ben kept glancing back, offering Jackson a small wave as his father led him toward their car. Jackson raised his hand in a silent goodbye, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was a simple exchange, but one that left a quiet warmth in his chest. For a long time after they left, Jackson remained seated under the oak tree, his thoughts lingering on the boy's words. Despite their vastly different lives, Jackson felt he understood Ben better than he'd expected. He'd always believed loneliness was a burden unique to him, a side effect of the life he now led. But Ben's innocent honesty had shown him that loneliness could reach anyone, even those with loving families and stable homes. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting warm golden hues across the park, Jackson finally pulled himself up from the bench. He brushed off his coat, more out of habit than necessity, and took one last look at the empty playground. The peace he had found here earlier had shifted into something more reflective, a reminder of how far he'd come, and how far he still had to go. By the time he left the park, the streets were beginning to fill with families heading home, couples taking evening strolls, and joggers wrapping up their daily routines. Jackson kept to the edges of the sidewalk, unnoticed in his worn-out clothes and quiet presence. The brief connection he'd felt with Ben was already fading, returning him to the solitude he knew so well. But just as he started to push the memory of the day to the back of his mind, he heard a small voice calling his name. "Jackson!" He turned, surprised to see Ben standing a few steps behind him, breathless from running. His father stood a short distance away, talking on his phone, but his gaze remained firmly fixed on his son. "Hey, kid," Jackson said, a little stunned but pleased to see him. "Thought you'd be home by now." Ben's cheeks flushed as he shifted his weight, looking down for a moment before meeting Jackson's eyes. "I just wanted to say, I hope I see you again." Jackson felt his throat tighten slightly. He hadn't expected the boy to care, much less go out of his way to say goodbye again. "You know where to find me," he replied, gesturing back toward the oak tree. "I'm here a lot." Ben's face lit up, the hint of a grin breaking through. "Okay," he said, giving a little nod before turning to rejoin his father. Jackson watched him go, feeling an odd sense of pride for this small, unexpected friendship that had formed so quickly and naturally. As Ben and his father disappeared down the sidewalk, Jackson felt lighter than he had in a long time. He hadn't realized how much he missed simply talking to someone, sharing a moment that wasn't burdened by survival or struggle. With a renewed sense of purpose, he decided he would return to this park more often, not just to rest, but to remember that, even in his isolated world, connections were still possible. Over the next few days, Jackson found himself drifting back to the park, scanning the playground out of habit, though he never expected to actually see Ben again. Yet, despite himself, he hoped. One late afternoon, Jackson had just settled onto the bench when he spotted a familiar figure walking down the park path. Ben's father was there, but this time he was alone, his usual professional demeanor softened, looking around as if searching for something. Jackson felt a pang of curiosity and sat up straighter, uncertain of what to expect. The man finally spotted Jackson under the tree and approached him, his steps steady but cautious. Jackson noted the man's serious expression, his eyes showing a hint of discomfort, as if he were stepping out of his own comfort zone. "Jackson, right?" he asked, stopping a few feet away. Jackson nodded, standing to meet him. "That's right." Ben's father extended his hand. "My name's Marcus Hayes," he said, his tone more personable than the distant politeness from before. Jackson shook his hand, a bit surprised at the formal introduction. "Nice to meet you, properly," Jackson replied, feeling the urge to break the ice. "How's Ben?" Marcus's face softened at the mention of his son. "He's good. He hasn't stopped talking about you since that day. Said you really helped him out, made him feel safe." Jackson nodded, not quite sure what to say. "He's a good kid. Glad I could be there for him." Marcus glanced down, seeming to choose his next words carefully. I know we're from different worlds, he began slowly, but I wanted to thank you. I appreciate you helping Ben when he needed it. Not everyone would have stepped in. Jackson shrugged, brushing it off. It was nothing. Just didn't want to see the kid getting hurt. Marcus nodded, a faint smile appearing for a moment. It may have been nothing to you, but it meant a lot to him, and to me. He paused, looking Jackson over as if noticing him for the first time beyond his worn clothes and tired stance. Marcus's thoughtful expression hinted at an unspoken question, something that lingered in the air, bridging the gap between their worlds. For a moment, there was a stillness between Jackson and Marcus, as though they were both standing on opposite sides of an invisible line, each unsure of how to cross it. Marcus took a breath, his gaze firm yet contemplative. "Listen, I don't know your story, and I don't mean to pry," Marcus began, his tone sincere, "but Ben sees something in you. He keeps asking if we can come back to the park to find you." Jackson was taken aback. He hadn't thought that a simple act of kindness would resonate so deeply, let alone linger in the mind of a young boy who seemed to have everything. "Ben's a special kid," Jackson replied, a touch of admiration in his voice. "He's got a good heart. I'm glad he feels comfortable around me." Marcus hesitated, then spoke, a hint of self-awareness in his voice. "I'm sure you've noticed that my life is, well, different than yours," he said. "It's not something I've ever thought much about until Ben met you." Jackson nodded, not taking offense. He knew it was the truth. Marcus continued, "But maybe that's not a reason to keep our worlds apart. I wanted to see if you'd be interested in coming by sometime, maybe for a meal. Ben would love it, and I'd like to hear more about you." Jackson was quiet for a moment, the invitation surprising him more than he let on. It wasn't often that someone like Marcus, well-dressed, successful, and seemingly secure, reached out to someone in his position. Part of him wanted to turn down the offer, to stay in the shadows where he felt safe. But he thought of Ben's hopeful face, his eagerness to find a friend in Jackson, and he found himself nodding. "All right," Jackson replied, his voice steady. "I'd like that." Marcus gave a small, relieved smile. "Great. How about tomorrow evening? I'll pick you up here, say, around 6? Jackson agreed, still feeling a mix of apprehension and curiosity as Marcus nodded and walked away, leaving him with a lot to think about. It was one thing to meet someone in a park, but stepping into their world, even for just a meal, felt like a risk. Still, the thought of reconnecting with Ben made it feel worthwhile. The following evening, Jackson found himself back under the oak tree, his heart racing in anticipation. Right on time, Marcus pulled up in a sleek car, the headlights briefly illuminating Jackson's weathered face. Marcus stepped out, giving Jackson a friendly nod, and opened the passenger door for him. "Ready?" Marcus asked, his tone both casual and warm, sensing Jackson's nerves. Jackson took a breath, nodded, and slid into the car, feeling a little out of place but determined to make the most of the opportunity. As they drove, Marcus filled the silence with casual conversation, talking about the neighborhood, the recent changes in the city, and even a little about his work. Jackson listened, taking in the snippets of a life so different from his own. When they arrived at Marcus's home, Jackson couldn't help but feel a bit overwhelmed by the sight of it. The house was large and elegant, with a well-manicured lawn and glowing lights that cast a warm, inviting glow over the entrance. He hesitated, but Marcus gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Come on in," Marcus said, leading the way. Inside, Jackson was greeted by the cozy scent of dinner and the sound of Ben's excited footsteps as he ran down the stairs. "Jackson, you're here," Ben shouted, his face lighting up as he bounded over to greet him. "Hey, kid," Jackson replied, unable to keep from smiling. "Didn't think you'd be this excited to see me." Ben grinned, nodding enthusiastically. "I've been waiting all day. Dad said we could eat together and play games after." Jackson chuckled, glancing over at Marcus, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Sounds like a plan," Jackson replied, feeling some of his nerves ease in the warmth of the house. They moved to the dining room, where a simple but hearty meal had been set out. Jackson took a seat across from Marcus with Ben seated beside him, chatting happily about his day at school. Jackson listened, his own childhood memories drifting back as he watched the boy's infectious energy. Over dinner, Marcus asked Jackson about his past, not prying but genuinely interested. Jackson was cautious at first, unsure of how much to share. But gradually, he opened up, telling Marcus and Ben about his early years, his love for working with his hands, and how life had taken unexpected turns. He avoided the hardest parts of his story, but Marcus seemed to understand, not pressing for details. As dinner came to an end, Ben pulled Jackson into the living room, eager to show him his favorite game. Marcus stayed back for a moment, watching his son with Jackson. For the first time, he saw Ben laughing and sharing something special with someone outside of their immediate circle, and it struck him how impactful a small act of kindness could be. Later, as Jackson prepared to leave, Marcus walked him to the door. "Thank you for coming," he said sincerely. "It's not often Ben connects with someone so quickly. I can see you're a good influence on him." Jackson nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude that surprised him. "Thanks for inviting me. It's been a long time since I've had a meal with good company." Marcus extended his hand, a gesture that felt both formal and meaningful. "I hope you'll come back sometime." Jackson shook his hand, glancing over his shoulder to see Ben waving from the living room. "I'd like that." As Jackson walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner had marked the start of something much bigger than just a single evening. As Jackson walked down the quiet neighborhood street, the glow from Marcus's house fading behind him, he felt a mix of emotions that surprised him. The evening had been pleasant. More than pleasant, really. Ben's laughter and Marcus's warm hospitality had stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. A sense of belonging. But as he neared the park where he would spend the night, Jackson couldn't help but feel a weight settle in his chest. Despite the kindness he'd experienced that night, he knew that his world and Marcus's world were light years apart. Marcus and Ben would go home to their comfortable life, while Jackson would return to his routine of finding a safe spot to sleep and scrounging up food where he could. That sharp contrast hit him hard. Settling down on his usual bench under the oak tree, Jackson pulled his worn coat tightly around him, hoping to block out the cold creeping into the air, and the doubts creeping into his mind. Had it been foolish to accept Marcus's invitation? He didn't want to be a charity case or a burden, and he certainly didn't want Ben's father to feel obligated to reach out. He shook his head, trying to push away the thoughts. Tonight had been genuine, he reminded himself. Marcus had extended an invitation, not out of pity, but out of a shared understanding. A bridge formed by Ben's innocent trust and Jackson's simple act of kindness. The next few days were quiet. Jackson kept to himself, spending his time doing odd jobs where he could and returning to the park in the evenings. But deep down, he found himself hoping for another chance encounter with Ben or Marcus. He missed the warm meal, the laughter, and, strangely enough, the sense of connection that he'd felt that night. Then, one afternoon as Jackson sat on his bench, he saw a familiar figure coming toward him. Ben, with his backpack slung over one shoulder, was walking down the park path with a determined stride. Behind him, Marcus followed at a more relaxed pace, a faint smile on his face as he watched his son. "Jackson!" Ben called, waving excitedly as he ran up. "Hey, kid," Jackson replied, surprised but genuinely happy to see him. He glanced up at Marcus, who nodded in greeting as he approached. "Hope we're not disturbing you," Marcus said, taking a seat on the bench beside Jackson. "Ben wouldn't stop asking if we could come find you." Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. "Not disturbing me at all. I could use the company." Ben beamed, taking a seat on the other side of Jackson. "I brought my soccer ball," he said eagerly. "I thought maybe we could play a little?" Jackson glanced between Marcus and Ben, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Why not?" he said with a grin. They moved to an open patch of grass, and for the next half hour, Jackson found himself laughing and running alongside Ben as they kicked the ball back and forth. Marcus joined in occasionally, cheering them on, and Jackson couldn't help but feel a rare sense of lightheartedness that hadn't come to him in years. After they finished, Ben flopped onto the grass, breathing hard but grinning from ear to ear. Jackson sat down beside him, catching his breath, while Marcus stood nearby, hands in his pockets, watching them with a thoughtful look. "You're pretty good, Jackson," Ben said, looking up at him with admiration. Jackson chuckled, ruffling Ben's hair. "Not as good as you, kid." As they started to pack up, Marcus glanced at Jackson, his tone casual but kind. "You know, Jackson, I was thinking, if you ever need anything, any help, or even just some company, don't hesitate to reach out. You're welcome anytime." Jackson felt a mix of gratitude and discomfort. He appreciated the offer, but part of him struggled to accept help, even from someone as genuine as Marcus. "I appreciate that," he said carefully, choosing his words. "But I'm doing all right. Been managing on my own for a while now." Marcus nodded, respecting Jackson's independence. "I get that, but just know the offer's there. Ben would be thrilled to see you more often." Ben looked up, nodding eagerly. "Yeah, Jackson, you could come over and we could play soccer again. Or you could tell me more stories. You've got great stories." Jackson smiled, the boy's excitement infectious. "We'll see, kid," he said, giving Ben a reassuring pat on the shoulder. As they said their goodbyes and Marcus and Ben headed back down the park path, Jackson stood watching them go, a bittersweet feeling settling over him. He wanted to be a part of their lives but feared dragging them into his struggles. They were good people, and the last thing he wanted was to impose on their kindness. But as he turned to leave, Ben gave one last wave, his grin wide and unreserved. For the first time, Jackson felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could be both part of their world and keep his dignity intact. As Jackson walked away, he found himself thinking about what it would mean to truly accept help and open up a new chapter in his life. The next morning, Jackson was back at his usual spot in the park, feeling the familiar pull of routine. The encounter with Marcus and Ben the day before had lingered in his mind all night. A part of him wanted to let his guard down and take Marcus up on his offer, but another part warned him against it. Accepting help meant accepting a level of vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself in years. As he sat quietly, lost in thought, Jackson noticed a figure walking toward him along the park path. He recognized Marcus's calm, steady gait and felt his heart pick up, unsure of what this visit would bring. Marcus offered a small smile as he approached. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the bench. "Go ahead," Jackson replied, shifting slightly to give him space. For a moment, they sat in silence, both watching the joggers and families that passed by. Then Marcus turned to Jackson, his expression thoughtful. "You know," Marcus began, "I didn't grow up with much. My parents worked hard, and we lived in a pretty modest neighborhood. I had friends who didn't make it out of that world. Some of them got caught up in things they couldn't escape." He paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "But there were people who helped me along the way. People who didn't have to, but did." Jackson nodded, listening intently. He didn't expect this kind of story from a man like Marcus, someone who seemed to have everything together. "I guess what I'm trying to say," Marcus continued, "is that you don't have to be on your own if you don't want to be." He looked over at Jackson, his expression earnest. "I'm not here to judge or to try to fix anything. But if there's any way I can help, I'd like to. Ben and I both would." Jackson looked down, feeling a lump in his throat. He appreciated Marcus's words more than he could express. Taking a deep breath, he finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "It's hard to explain, but when you've been on your own for so long, it feels strange to let someone in." Marcus nodded, his gaze understanding. "I get that. It doesn't have to be all at once, just one step at a time." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, each man lost in his thoughts. Jackson felt something shift within him, a quiet acceptance and a willingness to at least try. He had nothing to lose by taking a small step forward. Finally, Jackson turned to Marcus, giving him a nod. "All right, I'll give it a shot." Marcus smiled, relief evident in his expression. "Good. Just know that our door is open whenever you're ready." The following weekend, Jackson found himself nervously standing in front of Marcus's house once again. This time, however, he wasn't just a guest. He was there to spend time with both Marcus and Ben, as Marcus had invited him to join them for the day. Jackson felt both excitement and nerves as he knocked on the door. Ben answered almost immediately, his face lighting up. "Jackson, you came back." "Hey, kid," Jackson replied with a grin, feeling his own nerves ease a bit at Ben's enthusiasm. Marcus appeared behind his son, greeting Jackson with a nod. "Glad you could make it. We were thinking of heading out to the soccer field nearby if you're up for it." "Sounds great," Jackson said, trying to keep his tone casual, even as he felt a spark of excitement. The three of them made their way to the local soccer field, where Ben immediately started dribbling the ball across the grass. Jackson and Marcus followed, both joining in, and soon they were kicking the ball back and forth, laughing and enjoying the day. For a few hours, Jackson forgot about his struggles. He felt like any other man spending a weekend afternoon with friends, the worries of his daily life fading into the background. He was simply Jackson, the guy who could play soccer, joke around, and share stories with a young kid and his dad. After they'd all worn themselves out, they made their way back to Marcus's house, where they relaxed in the living room, sharing stories and chatting over sandwiches. Ben listened intently as Jackson told stories of his younger days, times when he'd felt free and full of possibility. For a moment, he saw himself through Ben's eyes, as someone capable, interesting, and worthy of respect. As evening approached, Jackson stood to leave, thanking Marcus for the afternoon, but Marcus stopped him, a hint of concern in his eyes. "Jackson, I want you to know," he began carefully, "if you ever find yourself needing a place to stay, even just for a night, our home is open to you. No strings attached." Jackson hesitated, feeling a mix of gratitude and discomfort. "Thanks, Marcus. That means more than you know." Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, we all need a reminder that we don't have to go it alone." Jackson nodded, his heart full. He left their home that night feeling the weight of his loneliness begin to lift, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. For the first time in years, Jackson felt he was on the brink of real change, a chance to rewrite his story with the support of people who truly cared. The following days felt different for Jackson. The simple offer of friendship from Marcus and Ben had opened a door he hadn't realized he needed. The warmth of their home, their laughter, and their kindness clung to him, giving him something to hold on to. For the first time in years, he wasn't facing the world completely alone. One morning, as Jackson sat in his usual spot at the park, he noticed a few job flyers tacked up on a community bulletin board nearby. Normally, he would pass them by without a second thought, but today, something in him stirred. Taking a deep breath, he walked over and began reading through the postings. Most were temporary jobs or part-time work, but one caught his eye: a maintenance position at a local community center. The work was basic: cleaning, minor repairs, some gardening. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something Jackson knew he could handle. He tore off the contact information and slipped it into his pocket, feeling a small spark of determination. If he could land this job, it might be a way to start rebuilding his life, slowly and on his own terms. Later that day, Jackson found himself standing in front of the community center, hands stuffed into his coat pockets. The place was bustling with activity, children running in and out, adults chatting, and a few volunteers tending to a small garden out front. Jackson felt a bit out of place, his worn coat and tired eyes setting him apart from the cheerful crowd. Taking a deep breath, he walked up to the front desk and asked to speak with the manager. A few minutes later, a woman named Carla greeted him, her eyes kind but assessing. "So, you're interested in the maintenance job?" she asked, looking over his shoulder as if gauging his suitability. Jackson nodded, feeling the familiar pang of self-doubt creep in. "Yes, ma'am. I've done maintenance work before, know my way around tools, and, well, I could use the opportunity." Carla studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "It's hard work, but we appreciate people who take pride in what they do. I'll be honest, it's not high-paying, but it's steady. Think you can handle it?" Jackson straightened, nodding with conviction. "Absolutely. I'd be grateful for the chance." After a few more questions and a brief rundown of the job, Carla finally smiled. "You start on Monday. Welcome aboard, Jackson." Relief washed over him, and he felt a rare smile break across his face. "Thank you. I won't let you down." When Monday came, Jackson arrived early, eager to make a good impression. The work was just as tough as Carla had warned, but he found satisfaction in every task. Cleaning up the grounds, repairing small issues, and tidying up the space felt good, like he was part of something meaningful, a place where people came together to help one another. By the end of his first week, Jackson was exhausted but fulfilled. He had earned his pay honestly, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of accomplishment. His tired hands and sore muscles reminded him of his hard work, and the small stack of bills in his pocket was proof that he could support himself, even if only in small steps. On Friday evening, Marcus invited Jackson over for dinner, eager to hear about his first week on the job. Jackson hesitated, feeling a mix of pride and nerves, but he accepted. When he arrived, Ben greeted him with his usual enthusiasm, his eyes wide with excitement. "Jackson, how was your first week? Did you fix a lot of things?" Ben asked, bouncing slightly as he spoke. Jackson laughed, settling into a chair at the dining table. "Yeah, kid, fixed plenty. I'm learning a lot too." As they enjoyed dinner together, Jackson shared stories from his week, small mishaps, funny moments with the kids at the center, and the satisfaction of doing a good job. Marcus listened intently, nodding with approval. "It sounds like you're really settling in," Marcus said. "I'm proud of you, Jackson. It's not easy to start fresh." Jackson felt a warmth spread through him, both from the meal and from Marcus's support. "Thank you. I didn't think I'd find something like this. It's different than I imagined." As the evening wore on, Jackson felt himself relaxing, letting his guard down around the family that had come to mean so much to him. Ben chatted on about school, Marcus shared funny stories from his work, and Jackson found himself laughing more than he had in years. For once, the future didn't feel so daunting. It felt manageable, even promising. As he left that night, Marcus walked him to the door, pausing as Jackson prepared to step out into the cool night air. "Jackson," Marcus said, his tone sincere, "you're making real progress. If you ever need anything, help with bills, groceries, or just someone to talk to, you know where to find us." Jackson looked down, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Marcus. Really, you've done more than enough already." Marcus smiled, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Sometimes it's the small things that make all the difference. Jackson nodded, and as he walked away, he felt lighter, as though the weight of the past was finally beginning to lift. The road ahead was still long, but he knew he wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, he could build a life worth living. With a job and newfound friendships, Jackson felt a quiet strength growing within him, one that hinted at even bigger changes on the horizon. With a few steady weeks under his belt, Jackson found himself settling into a rhythm at the community center. Each morning, he'd arrive early, ready to tackle whatever maintenance or repairs needed doing, and each evening he'd leave tired but satisfied. For the first time in years, he had something that felt close to stability, a job, a purpose, and people who genuinely cared about him. One afternoon, as he was fixing a light fixture in one of the center's hallways, Carla approached him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Jackson," she began, "I just wanted to say that you're doing an incredible job here. The place hasn't looked this good in ages, and people are really noticing." Jackson felt a rush of pride. "Thank you, Carla. I'm just glad I can help out." She hesitated, then continued, "There's something I wanted to ask you. We have a volunteer position that just opened up to help run an after-school program for some of the local kids. They need a little extra guidance, and I think you'd be great for it." Jackson blinked in surprise. The idea of mentoring kids and helping them find their way was both exciting and intimidating. He had never imagined himself in such a role, but he found himself nodding slowly. "I'd love to help out," he replied. "If you think I'd be a good fit, I'll give it my best shot." Carla smiled, looking relieved. "Thank you, Jackson. These kids could use a role model, someone who understands where they're coming from." Bookmark. On the first day of the after-school program, Jackson arrived to find a group of kids waiting, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. He was used to keeping to himself, so earning their trust would be a challenge. But he was determined. Over the next few days, he spent time getting to know each of them, listening to their stories, and encouraging them to open up. Slowly, they began to warm up to him, their guarded looks giving way to tentative smiles. Jackson found himself teaching them practical skills, things like repairing small objects or basic household fixes, and using these moments to share life lessons about resilience, patience, and determination. One evening, after a particularly good session with the kids, he returned to Marcus's house for dinner. Ben had been thrilled to hear about Jackson's new role and couldn't wait to ask him questions about his day with the kids. Do they listen to you, Jackson? Ben, eyes wide with curiosity. Jackson chuckled. Sometimes they don't. But they're good kids, and I think they just need someone to believe in them. Marcus looked at Jackson with quiet admiration. You're doing something amazing, Jackson. Those kids are lucky to have you. Jackson felt a surge of pride, but kept his tone humble. I'm just trying to make a difference, like you did for me. But as the weeks went on, Jackson's past began to creep up on him in unexpected ways. While he was slowly rebuilding his life, the weight of the struggles he'd endured lingered. One night, as he lay on his makeshift bed in the park, the familiar doubts crept in. Was he good enough? Could he really change? The next morning, his thoughts were heavy as he arrived at the community center. Carla was waiting for him, her usual warm smile absent. She gestured for him to follow her into her office, and Jackson felt a pang of anxiety as he sat down. Jackson, she began, her voice soft but serious, something's come up. I've received a complaint. A parent is concerned about your past, given that you're working with kids here. Jackson's heart sank. He had known this might happen someday, but it didn't make the reality any easier to face. He looked down, feeling the weight of his past mistakes settle heavily on his shoulders. I understand, he said quietly. If you need to let me go, I'll respect that. Carla's expression softened, and she shook her head. I don't want to lose you, Jackson. You've brought so much to this place, and I know how much the kids look up to you. But I do need you to be honest with me, and with the parents. Maybe if you share your story, they'll see why you're here. Jackson felt a lump in his throat, but he nodded. He had kept his past hidden for so long, fearing the judgment and rejection that would follow. But he realized now that hiding it would only keep him from fully moving forward. That evening, Jackson sat with Marcus, feeling the need to talk things through before he decided how to address Carla's request. Marcus listened patiently, his expression thoughtful. Jackson, you've been through a lot, and you've made incredible strides, Marcus said gently. Sharing your story could be hard, but it might also show people how far you've come. You're not that same person anymore. Jackson nodded slowly, taking in Marcus's words. I just don't want to lose everything I've worked for. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Jackson's shoulder. You won't, and you're not alone in this. We're here for you every step of the way. A few days later, Carla arranged a meeting at the community center with a few concerned parents. Jackson stood before them, his hands shaking slightly, but his voice steady as he began to speak. He told them about his past, the mistakes he had made, and the years he had spent trying to find his way back. He spoke honestly about the struggles he'd faced and how he had found purpose at the community center. He shared how he had changed and how he wanted to help others avoid the same pitfalls he had fallen into. When he finished, there was a long silence. Some parents exchanged looks, unsure of what to think, but one mother stepped forward, her expression softening. My son talks about you all the time, Mr. Jackson, she said quietly. He says you make him feel like he can do anything. I'd hate for him to lose that. The others murmured in agreement, and one by one they offered their understanding, recognizing Jackson's honesty and resilience. Carla gave him an approving nod, and Jackson felt a wave of relief wash over him. As Jackson left the meeting, he realized that he had taken the hardest step yet, and with it, he felt the last chains of his past start to release. The weeks following Jackson's meeting with the parents brought a new sense of freedom he had never known. Opening up about his past had felt like the most difficult step, but to his surprise, it had also brought him a deep sense of relief. He was no longer hiding, no longer carrying the weight of his past in silence. The community, especially the kids he worked with, looked at him not with judgment, but with admiration. They saw a man who had been through the hardest of times and come out stronger. One afternoon, as Jackson wrapped up his day at the community center, Carla approached him with a thoughtful expression. Jackson, she said, smiling warmly, the kids in the after-school program have really taken to you. I've been watching how they look up to you, how they hang on your every word. You're doing more than just showing them a new skill. You're inspiring them. Jackson felt a wave of gratitude. Thank you, Carla. I just want to be someone they can count on. She nodded. I can see that. And I was thinking, Maybe it's time we officially make you part of the program. You'd be a mentor, someone they can talk to, look up to. The job comes with a bit more pay and more responsibilities, but I think you're ready." Jackson's eyes widened. He had been grateful just to be helping out, but to be given a permanent role, something stable and meaningful, felt surreal. "Are you sure? I mean, with my past?" Carla shook her head firmly. "Jackson, everyone here knows your story, and that's exactly why they trust you. You've been where some of these kids are heading, and your insight could make all the difference. So yes, I'm sure." He nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and disbelief. "Thank you. I'd be honored." That evening, he found himself standing outside Marcus's house, eager to share the news. As he knocked on the door, he felt a sense of belonging he had never expected to feel. This place had become a refuge, a reminder that he had people who cared about him. Ben opened the door, grinning as he saw Jackson. "Jackson, you're here." "Hey, kid," Jackson greeted him, stepping inside. Marcus appeared in the hallway, his face lighting up as he saw the look on Jackson's face. "I have news," Jackson said, unable to keep the excitement out of his voice. "Carla offered me a permanent position at the community center. I'll be a mentor in the after-school program." Marcus beamed, clapping him on the shoulder. "That's amazing, Jackson. I knew they'd recognize your value." Ben jumped up and down with excitement. "Does this mean you'll be working with kids all the time? Like, showing them how to fix things and stuff?" Jackson chuckled, nodding. "Yep, I get to help them learn and hopefully guide them away from some of the mistakes I made." They settled around the table, and Jackson shared more details about the role, the responsibilities he'd be taking on, and his hopes for what he could bring to the program. Marcus listened with pride, while Ben looked at him like a hero. "You know," Marcus said after a moment, "I think this is just the beginning for you, Jackson. You've already come so far, and now you're in a position to help others find their way." Jackson nodded thoughtfully, feeling the truth of Marcus's words settle in. This was more than just a job. It was a purpose, a chance to give back and make a difference. Over the next few months, Jackson threw himself into his work at the community center. He spent hours with the kids, listening to their stories, helping them with their struggles, and teaching them practical skills. Slowly, he saw their confidence grow, their eyes lighting up with the realization that they could achieve more than they had ever believed. One afternoon, Jackson was cleaning up after a workshop when a young boy named Lucas approached him, looking nervous. "Mr. Jackson?" he asked quietly. Jackson turned, offering the boy a reassuring smile. "What's up, Lucas?" Lucas hesitated, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I wanted to say thanks. Before I started coming here, I didn't think I could do anything right, but you showed me that. Maybe I'm not so bad." Jackson felt a lump in his throat. He reached out, giving Lucas a gentle pat on the shoulder. "You're not maybe anything, Lucas. You're a smart kid, and you've got a lot to offer. Don't let anyone make you feel any less than that." Lucas smiled shyly, nodding before he ran off to join his friends. Jackson watched him go, feeling a sense of pride and purpose fill his heart. He had started out thinking he could never make a difference, but now he knew just how wrong he had been. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Marcus and Ben came by the center to see Jackson in action. Marcus watched with admiration as Jackson worked with the kids, guiding them patiently and encouraging them with every small success. Later, as they sat outside the center, Marcus looked at Jackson, his expression serious. "I don't think I've said this enough, Jackson, but I am truly proud of you. You've taken everything life threw at you and turned it into something positive. That takes real strength." Jackson looked down, feeling the weight of Marcus's words. "I couldn't have done it alone. You and Ben gave me a reason to keep going, to keep trying." Marcus smiled, placing a hand on Jackson's shoulder. "That's what friends are for. And if you ever need anything at all, just remember, you've got a family here." Jackson nodded, his heart full. He knew now that he wasn't just surviving, he was living, building a life he could be proud of, one day at a time. And with friends like Marcus and Ben, he felt ready to face whatever the future held. Jackson's journey was far from over, but with each step he grew stronger, finding purpose in helping others and discovering that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most meaningful victories. As the months passed, Jackson settled fully into his new role at the community center. He found himself looking forward to each day, eager to see the kids, hear their stories, and watch them grow. They came to him with their fears and dreams, and he felt a deep sense of purpose in guiding them, helping them see the world as a place of possibility instead of a series of closed doors. One afternoon, as Jackson was working in the garden area, Carla approached him with a look of excitement on her face. "Jackson, I have some news," she said, barely able to contain her grin. "Our center has been nominated for a Community Improvement Award, thanks in large part to the work you've done here." Jackson stared at her in disbelief. "You're kidding. I've only been doing my part. Nothing special." Carla shook her head. "Jackson, it's because of people like you that this place feels so welcoming. You've inspired the kids and the parents, and you've shown everyone that change is possible. We're holding a ceremony next month, and you'll be there as a guest of honor." Jackson felt a mix of pride and humility. He'd never expected any recognition. Just being able to work and contribute had been reward enough. But the thought of standing there, of being acknowledged for his work, made his heart swell. "Thank you, Carla. I don't know what to say." Carla smiled, giving him a reassuring nod. "You don't have to say anything, just keep being yourself." The night of the ceremony arrived, and Marcus and Ben were right there to support Jackson. Dressed in a simple but well-fitting suit that Marcus had helped him pick out, Jackson looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. The worn lines on his face seemed softer, his eyes brighter. He looked like someone with purpose, someone who belonged. "Looking sharp, Jackson." Ben cheered, giving him a thumbs up. Marcus grinned, placing a hand on Jackson's shoulder. "You earned this, my friend. Stand tall. You deserve to be here." As they arrived at the venue, Jackson was taken aback by the size of the crowd. People from all around the community had gathered, and he could see familiar faces from the center, parents, kids, and volunteers, smiling and waving in his direction. During the ceremony, Carla stood at the podium and spoke about the center's achievements and the impact Jackson had made since joining. As she called him up to the stage, Jackson felt a surge of emotion. Standing there in front of the people he had grown to care about, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. "Thank you," Jackson began, his voice steady but filled with feeling. "I never expected to find myself here. For a long time I was lost, struggling to find my way. But this community, you all welcomed me, gave me a chance, and believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I'm honored to be a part of this." He looked out into the crowd, catching Ben's beaming face and Marcus's proud expression. For the first time, Jackson felt like he had a place in the world, like he belonged to something bigger than himself. After the ceremony, Jackson found himself surrounded by people congratulating him. Parents approached him to share stories of how he had impacted their kids' lives, and volunteers praised his dedication. Amidst the crowd, Ben ran up to him and threw his arms around him in a hug. "You did amazing, Jackson," Ben exclaimed, his face glowing with pride. Jackson hugged him back, grinning. "Thank you, Ben. You've been a big part of this too." Marcus joined them, clapping Jackson on the back. "You've come a long way, Jackson, and I'm so proud of you." Jackson looked at his friend, his heart full. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Marcus. You and Ben, you're family to me." In the days following the ceremony, Jackson continued to work at the community center with a renewed sense of purpose. He had found more than just a job here. He had found a family, a community, and a second chance. Each day felt like a gift, an opportunity to grow and to give back. One afternoon, as he was finishing up a workshop with the kids, Lucas, the young boy who had once struggled with his confidence, approached him with a shy smile. "Mr. Jackson," Lucas began, looking up at him, "I wanted to tell you, I got into the advanced science program at school. They said my project was one of the best." Jackson's face broke into a proud smile. "Lucas, that's incredible. I knew you could do it." Lucas shrugged, his cheeks flushing. "I wasn't sure at first, but you helped me believe in myself." Jackson felt his throat tighten as he placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You did all the hard work, Lucas. I just gave you a little push." The boy smiled up at him, and Jackson knew that this was what it was all about. The chance to help these kids find their way, to guide them toward a brighter future, made every struggle worth it. As Jackson walked home that night, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. Life had thrown him challenges, and he had nearly lost himself to despair. But with the support of Marcus, Ben, and his newfound purpose at the community center, he had found his way back. In the quiet moments, Jackson often reflected on how far he had come. He had spent years surviving, moving through each day with little hope, but now he was living, truly living, with a sense of purpose and belonging. This story reminds us that courage, kindness, and second chances often come from the most unexpected places. Jackson's journey shows us that despite a person's past or circumstances, everyone has the potential to make a difference, inspire others, and build a better future. Through simple acts of compassion, Jackson not only changed his own life, but also touched the lives of those around him, proving that the power of redemption is truly within us all. If you enjoyed this story, comment 1 below. If you found it truly inspiring, comment 2, and let us know why. And don't forget to share your own stories of resilience and hope. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the uplifting stories we have coming up. Let us know your thoughts about Jackson's journey in the comments below.